A ver, yo creo que ya estamos suficientemente tarde. Hola. Y bueno, encantado de saludaros. Esto es un poquito una atrapallada, como diría la mujer de nuestro anfitrión, porque yo no tenía que estar aquí, yo tenía que estar allí. Pero hay un tema vocal y entonces yo siempre estoy preparado. Si José no puede esa tarde hablar, pues siempre me pongo la corbata y tal, a ver si me pasa lo de All About Eve, y soy como la pérfida protagonista que al final se queda con el galán. Pero bueno, bromas aparte, es un placer enorme, querido embajador, queridos amigos, teneros aquí en una casa maravillosa, que es esta de Herzog de Morón, pero de la Caixa sobre todo, absolutamente espectacular el auditorio y el edificio y la actividad que hace Caixa Forum en Madrid. Y todo esto para presentar a una persona que yo no debería presentar, porque yo creo que muchos de vosotros lo conocéis mejor que yo, ¿no? Se trata de Robin Niblett. Robin es muy conocido en España porque a él le gusta mucho España. Ya sabéis que es medio mallorquín y habla perfectamente español, con lo cual las preguntas os ruego que no hagáis un esfuerzo en la lengua de Shakespeare y que las hagáis directamente en español, porque así aprendemos todos, ¿no? Robin, para los que no le conozcan, que dudo mucho que haya alguien aquí, pero for the record, ha sido director y CEO de Chatham House, que en realidad es the Royal Institute of International Affairs, de 2007 a 2020. Como dicen mis notas, posiblemente, y aquí miro a Charles Powell con un poco de vergüenza, el think tank más admirado del mundo, ¿no? Uno de ellos, vamos a decir que es uno de ellos, ¿no? Al que hoy sigue asociado como Distinguished Fellow. Antes fue vicepresidente ejecutivo y director de operaciones del Center for Strategic and International Studies, como sabéis, con sede en Washington. Los comentarios y los análisis de Robin, aparte de ser escuchados, aparecen por escrito con frecuencia en el Financial Times, en el Washington Post, y también se le oye, se le ve, se le escucha en la CNN y en Reuters. Es autor de varias obras y algunas que he leído con mucho interés por la parte profesional que me toca. Y a nuestro querido embajador también. Gran Bretaña, la Unión Europea y el mito de la soberanía, publicada en 2016, Gran Bretaña, Europa y el mundo, replanteamiento de los círculos de influencia del Reino Unido, 2015, y América en un mundo cambiante, una cuestión de liderazgo, 2010, un libro premonitorio. Ha comparecido, declarado en varias ocasiones ante el Comité de Defensa y el Comité de Asuntos Exteriores de la Cámara de los Comunes, lo cual, Robin, te preguntaré luego cómo fue la experiencia, así como ante los comités de asuntos europeos del Senado y la Cámara de Representantes de Estados Unidos. Lo más importante es que ha participado en debates y seminarios en el Aspen Institute España y en el Aspen Institute Italia, como somos generosos también les incluimos, ¿no? Así como en el Foro de las Tertulias Hispano-Británicas y seguro que también en el Real Instituto Elcano. Pasó buena parte de su infancia y juventud en Mallorca, como he dicho, y es consejero externo de Fidelity European Values Investment Trust y de Ledwell Advisory. Ejerce como asesor especial de la Comisión de Asuntos Exteriores de la Cámara de los Comunes desde 2015. Fue presidente del Grupo de Expertos de la Cumbre de la OTAN de 2014 y durante el jubileo de platino de la reina Isabel II fue nombrado en 2022 Knight Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. Kindly call me God, ¿no? Se licenció en lenguas modernas y obtuvo un máster y un doctorado en el New College de Oxford. Sin más preámbulos, Robin, the floor is yours.
Pues muchas gracias, Pablo, por esa presentación larga y con mucho del pasado. Espero que tenga todavía un futuro también. Pero realmente es un placer estar aquí con todos ustedes. esta tarde y en este edificio tan impactante e increíble. Muchas gracias a Caixa Forum por ser nuestros hosts esta tarde. Es un placer y, claro, muchas gracias José, Aspen España, todos el equipo que conocí esta mañana, que fue realmente un placer. Y de ver aquí también amigos muchos desde hace mucho tiempo, Andrés y, claro, Charles y el Real Instituto Elcano, del que soy miembro del Consejo Científico, con gran placer también. Pero mira, esta noche vamos a hablar de algo enorme. Me veo el título, no sé por qué di un título tan enorme, pero mira, al final y al cabo, en unos 20 minutos, algo así, 25 como máximo, y para hacerlo más brevemente que lo haría, mejor hacerlo en inglés, porque el español me va bien un poco, pero después con hablar de este tipo de cosas, más fácil en inglés. Pero como ha dicho Pablo, muy contento de hacer las preguntas en castellano. Right, let's go in here. So the title I planned for this evening, Navigating a More Diverse World, Trying to Think About Geopolitics in 2023, seems like a good thing to do at the beginning of any year. I am practicing on you a bit, yeah, because I'm still trying to work it out. It is a very, very complicated international context at the moment. When I stepped down as the director of Chatham House this summer, in July of 22, I did a farewell lecture, and I talked about a divided world at that time. And it struck me that it was important to come up with the word divided, because Britain, in particular, has been talking about this being a competitive world for a long time. But as I was saying this morning to the Aspen small group that we had the pleasure of talking to, competitive has a positive connotation to it, not just a negative connotation. Competition gives opportunity for absolute gains, for countries to be able to improve and get the most out of it. A divided world is more about zero-sum. It's more about defense. It's more about protecting yourself against how others might gain. And it does strike me that one of the most interesting things about 2022 is how it really clarified. It was like a year of strategic clarification about the global division that we'd entered into. And I'll say a little bit about that maybe at the beginning, why I think this is a divided world. Where are we starting 2023 from? Before I go into the second half and talk about what we're going into in 2023, which obviously is me looking to the future, and I hope you will challenge me in your questions or disagree or whatever you choose to do. But I think that what's going to be different about 2023 is that we're going to have to set aside the clarification and think about the costs. What are the costs of a more divided world? How are they going to be divided up amongst the various international players? There's a chance, and I'll talk about it in a minute, that we will have a bit more division in the transatlantic relationship. I will talk also about how I think Russia and China are going to double down on their own separateness from us, but also maybe think a little bit about how the rest of the world sees this new division. What does it mean to them? And what might it mean to us in that case? So let me start off with about the world we've walked into, and the world that was revealed, that was clarified in 2022. Some touch points which will not be a surprise to you, but I think it's important to lay them out. The war in Ukraine clarified for all of us in Europe, painfully for Germany, that you cannot live and coexist in a constructive way alongside Russia led by Vladimir Putin. The war in Ukraine disabused us of any notions. But you've got to think about it from Putin's standpoint as well. For him, it was also a clarifying year. That America, from his perspective, is going to prevent Russia from reclaiming its rightful place in, let's call it the eastern part of Europe, but that it would be able to have a sphere of influence that really belongs to it. I think he thought that maybe he'd get away with it in Ukraine. It's been a clarifying year for him as well. I think it's been clarifying that despite what's happened in Ukraine, America could still keep its strategic focus on what Tony Blinken called the #1 threat to world order in the future, which is China. And they have tightened up their limits on export of US technology, their limits on Chinese access to the US market. And Biden himself asserted that if there was an attack on Taiwan, America would come and defend Taiwan against China. A clarifying moment. And again, let's look at it from the other point of view. For Beijing, it's been a clarifying year as well. Despite Ukraine, despite Russia and the attacks there, we had the visit by Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, to Taiwan. And I think Beijing is now utterly convinced that America's objective is not just to compete with China, but to contain it, to contain its power, to try to hold it back. And that is the conclusion that Xi Jinping drew from 2022. It also, of course, gave him the reason to clarify that he is the undisputed leader of China. When he strode onto that stage in December at the 20th Party Congress with no obvious successor behind him, it was clarified for all of us that this is the man who rules China and will for the foreseeable future. Another dimension of clarification has been about, therefore, the geopolitical division that's come from this. Alliances are stronger and clearer. NATO is going to enlarge, as we know, probably, to Sweden and Finland. We have Japan at the same time, realizing that it's going to take care of its own defense, its own security, in a much more active way than it did in the past. We've seen actually a very interesting revelation and understanding that Xi and Putin, Russia and China, understand how much they need each other in this moment of strategic competition, with a NATO that is now calling out China as a geopolitical threat, and countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, committing themselves more to European security, as they did when they attended the NATO summit here in Madrid. What they've done, for their part, Russia and China, is create more of an alignment between those two countries, laid out in the No Limits Partnership statement of February the 4th, but importantly, it's been sustained through the conflict. Despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China has not abandoned Russia. They've been very careful not to provide material support to Russia, which would conceivably then expose them to secondary sanctions from the United States. What they have done, however, is possibly the most important thing you could do from Russia, which is to support the narrative that the reason for the invasion of Ukraine was the threat of NATO, and that it's almost a justified war. And that narrative has been shared widely by China. And what it's done is it's said to the 150 countries that are not imposing sanctions on Russia, it's fine, carry on trading with them. This is just a little battle, an old Cold War 2.0 being run in the Northern Hemisphere. You have the right to continue trading with Russia, and they're helping Russia in a way shift its whole economic strategic direction from west to east and south. What this unveiling both of the Russia-China partnership has done, this sense that the two of them are together, is I think what was the biggest change of 2022, which is what I've described as the emergence of an Atlantic-Pacific partnership. For the first time ever, as far as I know, America's transatlantic and trans-Pacific alliances are blending together. As I described it, you've had the summit at NATO visited by and participated in by Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. But what you're getting here is a sort of a commanding group, a G7 plus, which is thinking, how do we defend ourselves together, not separately transatlantic and separately trans-Pacific, but together as a community of liberal democracies. How do we defend ourselves, make sure we've got the technological high ground, make sure we've got the critical supply chains, make sure we have energy security amongst us in this much more divided and dangerous world. I think the other clarifying element for 2022, which is, I suppose, a different one, is the loss of global hierarchy. We've seen that in the end, as much as this transatlantic, trans-Pacific community has come together, other countries in the world see this as an opportunity to triangulate, to play off Russia and China on the one hand, Europe and the United States on the other. They have been empowered by this new division in the world. You could take your examples. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India stand out as countries, each of which, I'm sure you can think of the examples, have been able to, on the one hand, maybe confront Russia, as Turkey certainly done by supplying weapons to Ukraine, but at the same time cozy up to Russia, as both India and Turkey have done through big economic agreements and energy importation. I would say, however, that it's not all gone in Russia and China's way. Triangulation cuts both ways. And Vladimir Putin had a very difficult and awkward Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Samarkand last year, where he was, in essence, called out, in particular by Modi, the Prime Minister, for the global impacts of the war. And I'd say even the Bali summit, the G20 summit in Bali, was another moment where the script didn't quite go the way that China and Russia had expected, with a much tougher calling out of the negative sides of the war of Russia and Ukraine. Now, the impacts, the last thing about 2022 I'll say before I move on to the era we're in now, the last thing I'd say is that the impacts on the global economy haven't been entirely negative. They have been negative if you're a poorer country that relies heavily on importing food, that has heavy debt in dollars. The World Food Organization, World Food Program, estimates that the amount of people facing acute food insecurity has risen from about 135 million in 2019 to 345 million, tripled in 2022. But there have been winners. If you're in the UAE or in Saudi Arabia, your sovereign wealth fund is much larger. You're now able to invest in a true transformation of your economy, building mega cities and so on. But I think the more interesting one, and an interesting example of triangulation, has been in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia, where countries in that part of the world have managed to develop what I think of as sort of layered globalization. It's not pure, it's in layers of intensity, depending on where you think you can trust the values of your partners. So we've seen in the same year, the 9th member of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trading alliance involving certain ASEAN countries and Pacific Rim American countries, building up quite an intense and high-quality trade agreement that includes services in there, that includes e-commerce, that includes restrictions on state-owned enterprises. But at the same time, that grouping, led by Japan, trying to push some of the values of open markets, those same countries also signed up to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership with China, a China-led initiative. It's a thinner trade agreement, but it does now cover 30% of global GDP, over 2 billion people, $26 trillion. No America, no Europe in that agreement. In a way, Japan is having its cake and eating it. It's deepening its trading relationship with China. At the same time, it's playing the role as a champion of the liberal economy through the TPP. Let me turn to 2023 so we don't spend too long on the past and start to look to the future. What does this sort of divided world mean for the future? This is my crystal ball gazing, I suppose. As I said, I want to talk a little bit about how US and Europe are handling it, a little bit about whether there'll be some transatlantic tensions, then Russia and China, then two issues I think we need to look for. Spoilers and spillovers, the countries that are going to try and take advantage of this in a more negative way, and some of the spillovers. I'd say that almost maybe counterintuitively, 2023 economically could be almost a better year for Europe and America than 2022. Yes, there are costs to pay from the adjustment away from Russian energy, and in America there are costs to pay from the high inflation and the higher interest rates that are there right now. But the amazing thing of 2022 is it provided a sort of discipline for their still very brittle political systems, their very divided political systems, to nonetheless make some really big breakthroughs at a very systemic level for their economies. America, as you know, the Biden administration was able to push through, squeak through, just in the last two big packages of infrastructure and the Inflation Reduction Act, about over $2 trillion worth of spending into the economy over the next 10 years. Europe, however, stung, you might say, into action, both by COVID and obviously by having to deal without Russian energy inputs, is repurposing a good chunk of its next generation EU 750 billion euro package towards an accelerated green agenda. And I think it surprised me, maybe it surprised a lot of the world, to see Germany, in essence, cut Russian gas entirely out of its energy mix. Europe as a whole cut Russian gas imports from 40% of its imports down to under 10%. That is a remarkable shift, given the physical infrastructure that linked Russia to the rest of Europe. And we're now in a position to start thinking about a west-east flow of energy interconnectors away from an east-west set of energy interconnectors. This is going to provide huge business opportunities for a lot of companies that will invest in this new infrastructure. And I've been pretty impressed that the EU managed to put caps, not just on oil, but caps on gas at the same time. And the cap on oil, I remember when Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, first proposed that somehow the G7 would do a cap on Russian oil prices using insurance, dominance of the insurance market to police and make that happen. I just thought that's going to be a stretch too far, but somehow it was pushed through because of the discipline of this divided world that emerged there. If I would say one other relatively optimistic thing about Europe, because I get lots of questions about whether the winter of 2023 is going to be a big crisis for Europe or not in terms of energy. My sense is, partly because we've had a mild winter, Europe has an opportunity to actually get through this winter relatively well. I say relatively well. I don't think there will be the blackouts. I'm sticking my neck out here. What they've done with the price caps, however, which is maybe most important, is protect government spending for support packages. In a way, they've capped that risk, even though companies themselves, even at the low rates of gas prices today, are going to be struggling to retain their industrial production. Despite this sort of somewhat more optimistic note, if I can say, about the economy, undoubtedly, governments on both sides are going to be on the defensive. They're going to be looking inwards, thinking, how do we make sure that our publics will be supported through this very difficult adjustment process? And there's been a lot of worry as to whether then Europe and America will sustain their support for Ukraine through 2023. Again, to go very quickly, despite the lurid commentary by Donald Trump Jr. calling President Zelensky a welfare scrounge, I hope that alliteration will give you a sense of what he meant by that. And Fox News' Tucker Carlson described Zelensky as dressed like the manager of a strip club when he spoke to the joint houses of Congress. But in a way, these strike me as minority views that were undercut by Trump and the far right's bad performance in the 2022 midterm elections. And while a Republican-controlled Congress is going to try to use Ukraine as a stick to beat Biden with, all of the old corruption, stories that the Trump administration tried to push 3-4 years ago, the Republicans, like the Democrats, are deeply opposed to Putin. Anti-Russia is strong, even though support for Ukraine might be a bit more conditional than it was before. And as for Europe, despite everything that's gone on, again, we can talk more about the Q&A, but my sense, there is still a very strong political commitment to Ukraine, most visible this morning in Germany's decision on the Leopard 2 tanks. They have no choice, in a way, but to stick wholeheartedly with their support of Ukraine, because all European leaders understand the stakes here. Well, almost all European leaders understand the stakes. The questions that we see right now aren't whether you support Ukraine militarily, it's how much lethality you provide to that support. But we will see some emerging transatlantic tensions, my second point here, but they come from a different angle. There's been a lot of discussion, obviously, about how, as both America and Europe turn inwards, try to manage the costs of this new world, that we're moving into a heavy war of subsidies following the American administration's introduction of its Inflation Reduction Act, nearly $400 billion worth of subsidies over the next 10 years, with a Buy American clause connected to it, as you all understand. Now, Europe is going to try to match that. I don't think there's going to be a war over this, quite simply because there's plenty of Europeans who want to buy a European act to go in parallel to it as well. The problem for Europe is that getting to that point is going to take a lot longer. You can say you want something in Europe, but as a form of government in the EU with 27 parties, America has already instituted its subsidies as of the 1st of January 2023, having passed the legislation in October of 2022. That is speed, yeah? I was in Davos last week. There were several delegations of American governors there meeting with European business leaders saying, come and invest now. We can give you special sweetheart deals. I was a meeting of the British-German Königswinter Group in November of last year. Several German companies said we have already moved investments we might have done in Europe over to America already, because the money is there now. And we know that America already has an advantage on the price of energy. So, this is going to create a soft tension between America and Europe. But at the same time, what it's done, in a way, is given permission to the EU to move forward with quite a controversial idea from the American perspective, which is the the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM, this famous carbon at the border tax that Europe has pushed through, first country to do this. This carbon border tax makes sense, protect European industries that are paying more for their carbon, encourage countries abroad through that sort of Brussels effect of European leadership in regulation, try to encourage other countries to reduce the amount of carbon so they can export into the EU without being penalized at the border. This all makes a certain amount of sense. You might argue the Americans shouldn't have too much to worry about. They don't export high carbon content products to Europe, but they are worried about two things. They're worried, number one, that actually a lot of the high carbon exports that currently go to Europe will be diverted over to the US, which does not have the carbon tax, and that we will then start to put more pressure on American industrial producers. They're also worried, of course, that the EU will use the carbon border tax to give subsidies to European industries that go beyond the green tech sector into all other sectors as well. So we can see a sort of nervousness, an edgy, sharp elbowness between Europe and America. They don't want to have a trade war, but they're going to be competing in the subsidy war across the Atlantic. Now, this might just be an observation, but I think it has a geopolitical spillover, which is the following. Through the course of 2023, Europe is going to start to realize that it is more and more responsible for the future of Ukraine. In December, it was the first time that European pledges and spending on Ukraine, 52 billion euros, has exceeded American spending and pledges on Ukraine, 48 billion euros. That shift and the realization, or the understanding, that Europe is going to have to spend the bulk of the money to reconstruct Ukraine whenever this conflict ends, means that I think Europeans are going to start to think, you know what, we need more of a say in the final outcome of this war. And we're going to get a much more edgy relationship towards the end of 2023, depending on how the conflict plays out militarily, you could get to a position where the Europeans are trying to, in a way, hold the Americans back. For America, the war in Ukraine is a long way away. For Europe, it's very close. And there are plenty of people who will be thinking about how this plays out. The other area where I can see some transatlantic tension emerging in the future, and it's interconnected, is over the relationship with China. If Europe is having to think more about the reconstruction of Ukraine and having Russia, in a way, cut off still from economic interaction with Europe for as far forward as you can see, the European perspective will be, it does not make sense to take on China at the same time. One or the other, but we can't do both simultaneously. Whereas from the US standpoint, deal with Ukraine so that you can then turn and deal with the big threat, which is China. And I think we're going to see a sort of, again, a bit of a division here. My sense from what I understand of Washington and the folks I know there and the people I've talked to there is that while the Biden administration wants to be pragmatic, more pragmatic than Trump, they can't work out the edges of that pragmatism. I like the idea of thinking about that the future of European and American trade and economic relationships with China is all about red lanes and green lanes. What's red and what's green? High technology is red, agriculture is very green. And there should be room to have a pretty good trading relationship. But the reality is that America is not quite sure where one starts and the other ends. Our cars, green lane, if they're full of technology now in electronic GPS systems and smart chips, is finance green? I know a lot of American banks thought finance was green lane. They're discovering now, with conversations with the American administration, that they're being told you better not bankroll China's dealing with its huge demographic change. There are many in America who think, good, China's demography is going to hold back its ability to spend on defense, its ability to spend globally. But if American banks go in and help have a much more efficient pension system, in a way, you're helping the Chinese government spend its money elsewhere. So you can see there's a much more zero-sum approach to China than there is in America. And this could spill over in this coming year to areas of American design, chip making, etc. Let me keep going, because I've only got 4 minutes left to stick to my time and leave plenty of time for questions. 2 more areas to talk about. One is where China and America can go, all of this, because we often have this idea that somehow it's up to us to determine where China and America will be globally, when in fact, obviously, they have their own agency. The simple thing to say about both Vladimir Putin and President Xi, is one of the more remarkable things, is that they start 2023, both of them, in so much of a weaker position than they were in 2022. I mean, not just Putin, because of the humiliations of the Ukraine conflict, but also Xi Jinping, who just 4 weeks ago was striding onto that stage at the 20th Party Congress, and now has had to do one of the most humiliating U-turns on his COVID policy, far more than anyone expected. So, will that make them both pull back? I think the opposite. They both double down. Putin doubles down because there's no way he can concede some type of a concession right now to Zelensky that would look like a defeat. It would sort of puncture that carefully curated impression he developed for the last few years of Russian military technical prowess and his own great vision of what Ruski Mir, the greater Russia, could be for the future. His life is at stake, never mind Russia's future at stake. I'd also say, at the moment, it strikes me he's not under too much pressure domestically. Most of the voices domestically say, fight more, not fight less. But Xi Jinping, similarly, he's had what you might have thought was a humiliating moment, but the fact that he could do such a quick U-turn on the back of protests tells me that he feels very secure in his position. No one's going to challenge him right now in making such a sudden move. In a way, the other risk is that as both of them, China is now, we've had all these news stories that Xi Jinping is firing the wolf warriors, that they're going to move to a much more accommodating foreign policy, that they want to make up. Liu He, the vice premier, was in Davos telling everyone that China's growth is back and they want partners to be able to do this with. But I think these are tactical changes that are not going to change China's trajectory. As I said, they understand America's out to contain them. They will continue their own decoupling from America. They will continue trying to change the terms of reference of multilateral institutions in the UN. The 26th of December, China undertook its biggest air incursion into what is known as Taiwan airspace, more than they did after Nancy Pelosi's visit. In the South China Sea, literally on New Year's Day, there was almost an air collision between a Chinese jet buzzing an American reconnaissance aircraft in the South China Sea. My sense is that at the moment, A, each of them are going to stick with the hard line, and B, they're each going to stick with the other. Because a weaker Putin means a weaker China. It is still very much zero-sum over this time. So to finish up with a couple of points, this leaves, I think, a room this year. In 2022, we had people, in a way, taking advantage of the division for almost positive reasons, you could say, at least to develop themselves economically. Southeast Asia, the Gulf states, etc. This year, I can see two countries trying to take advantage of it for negative reasons. One, of course, is Iran, which is going through a big, in the foothills of a big leadership change. Pushing its nuclear program would make sense in this context. They really don't have to worry too much that either China or Russia will try to hold them account for breaking out of their JCPOA commitments. If you are in North Korea, last year, in 2022, North Korea launched 95 ballistic or cruise missiles, including one over Japan for the first time, including another that pretty much proves incontrovertibly that North Korea can now hit mainland United States with one of its big intercontinental missiles. They only had 8 tests in 2021, 4 in 2020. There's been a ramping up. Now, I don't know where Kim Jong-un, what he'll do in 2023. No one can see inside that mind. But what we do know is he feels empowered, that China is not going to hold him to account. Russia, quite the opposite, needs North Korea. It needs North Korea for military exports and military equipment. So again, I think both of those countries end up being much more risk prone than they were in 2022. And this has spillover effects. If you are in Saudi Arabia building 4 megacities at the same time, you kind of thought that maybe you have America's back, but you are creating targets for Iran to hold, in a way, as hostages against them not criticizing you for their behavior in the future. And if you are building up your China +1 strategies in Southeast Asia, you're doing it in an environment that is becoming increasingly risky in terms of North Korea being able to spoil it and potential worries around Taiwan at the same time. And in terms of that Taiwan comment, my last spillover to put on the table here is about Taiwan specifically. It looks to me, and it looks to a lot of people, that Kevin McCarthy, the new Speaker of the House, will try to do a visit to Taiwan early, this year probably. How does China react? I don't think they're going to do something radical, but what they can do, again, to try to sort of spoil that capacity for Southeast Asia to take advantage of these divisions, what they might start doing is more naval exercises around the sea that, in a way, Taiwan treated as its own territorial maritime areas. You don't need to do a blockade. You don't need to have an invasion. You slowly start to make it less certain about what the future is for Taiwan as a critical part of global supply chains. So I suppose what I'm trying to say here is we have a much more complex year. The last spillover, which I think is a very important one to mention, is the deep, deep frustration which I sense emerging, I see it emerging, in what's nastily called or badly called the Global South. There is something almost a bit perverse about the satisfaction that I see in European capitals, in Washington, about the strength, finally, of the transatlantic and trans-Pacific relationship. We've got it together, and we're doing big subsidies. We're 400 billion for this, 400 billion for that, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, all these great initiatives. But if you're sitting in South Africa, or you're sitting in Latin America, you're saying, hold on a minute, so you can do 400 billion here, 400 billion there. Where's the 100 billion you said you'd promise to help us with climate mitigation and adaptation back in the Paris Agreement of 2015 to deal with carbon-induced climate change that you did and we are suffering from? And when you do a carbon border adjustment mechanism and we're planning to industrialize, shouldn't we be allowed to industrialize for a while? Or will there be exceptions for us as we come up? And when you say farm to fork strategy, this wonderful EU strategy, which I'm very much in favor of, you know, healthy farming, sustainable, before you can get into European markets. But if you're sitting again in poorer parts of the world, just trying to get onto the ladder, the danger is that actually in 2023, the global south is not just going to triangulate, it's going to lean towards China and Russia. Lean towards China and Russia. So, to conclude, can there be sort of order in all of this? I hear lots of people talking about perma-crisis, poly-crisis, the new normal. These are all terms that are trying to imply that there is a solidity, a stability to the world we're in. That I heard somebody say the other day, uncertainty is the new normal. What does that mean? You know, to me, it doesn't mean anything. It's a way to try to capture chaos in words and try to make it sound stable. I think the reality is right now that we do not have a delineated geopolitical standoff between the Russia-China alignment, the America with its Pacific and Atlantic alliances, the global south kind of having a common view. We don't. We are on the first rungs of an escalatory ladder where people don't know how much further things go up. And we haven't quite worked out yet the politics to manage the risks of escalation. This is something, as somebody said, we had muscle memory for in the Cold War, but we've had 20, 30 years to forget about the risks of escalation. And now we're having to learn the tactics, the ploys, the policies. And by the way, multilateral institutions are not going to help. They are not strong enough. They are divided right now. They're not there for that process. So where I'm putting my effort and where I believe we in liberal democracies need to make the effort is to make that G7+, which includes the EU, which includes Britain, and which includes a whole bunch of other countries with interests structurally in the future of liberal democracy, that we need to come together, make sure that we institutionalize in a way our cooperation, make it as inclusive as possible, and act at least as a stable pole within this much more disordered world. I've gone over time. I apologize. It was a big title. I'll stop there and happy to take some questions.
No sé si funciona eso, sí. Bueno, Robin, en fin, no sé por dónde empezar.
Mucho.
Pero, bueno, me ha parecido fascinante lo que has contado y cómo lo has contado, ¿no? Pero me gustaría empezar por el final, ¿no? Porque aquí estamos justo en el norte del Global South. Estás sentado en el norte del Global South. Sí. Y a mí personalmente, como diplomático y como español, tu última parte me ha resultado particularmente interesante y estimulante y quería que desarrollaras un poco más esto. Es decir, la irritación profunda del Global South, no solo por la falta de atención del Global North, sino por el contraste brutal, tanto a efectos de atención financiera, política. El caso de la migración en el centro y este de Europa ha sido chocante, ¿no? Bienvenidos. Cuando vivimos la ola migratoria del 2015, aquellos mismos países cómo reaccionaron. Este es una cuestión ya no solo de gestión del mundo, es una cuestión ética, ¿no? Quería que desarrollaras un poco más cómo ves, cómo podemos hacer la penitencia con el Global South y cuál crees tú que debía ser la trayectoria del Global North con ellos.
Pensaba que ibas a decir que España, que está en el sur del Global North.
También.
Pero los dos, claro. Pero el norte del Global South es más inclusivo, ¿no?
Sí, sí.
Más, que está muy bien. Voy a empezar en español, a ver qué tal va. Decía esta mañana, y lo he dicho antes, de que idealmente Europa tendría una perspectiva geopolítica y geoeconómica, por lo menos, que es más vertical y menos horizontal. Esto es lo tan frustrante de lo que ha hecho Rusia, es forzarnos a meternos otra vez en una perspectiva horizontal, oeste-este. Pero lo lógico para nosotros, para el futuro de Europa, es de pensar verticalmente. África, 1 billón de personas, 2 billones en 40 años, algo así, con todos los recursos que tiene de minerales, de all the resources of the green economy que podemos encontrar ahí. Una población con una energía, una juventud que necesitamos también. Y o sus países van a mejorar o van a buscar su vida con nosotros. Y necesitamos muchos, ¿no? Pero será más de lo que será posible para aceptar políticamente, supongo. ¿Cómo hacerlo? Es que es muy fácil decir estas cosas, pero la realidad me parece es que... voy a ir en inglés para ser más rápido. We're a long way away from having a structural perspective of how you link a community of countries that are not just advanced economically, but that have constructed themselves, the EU in particular, into a legal infrastructure that is so, I'll say advanced, but is also very complex and full of a lot of legal requirements, etc., to find a way of integrating with the global south, in this case Africa, that has just finally struck a free trade agreement, finally, but has not yet completely worked out even how to implement it. I asked this question, can we go vertical? I asked the question to Valdis Dombrovskis in Davos last week, and I thought he gave me a very interesting answer, which is that we'd like to, but we can't engage yet because the African countries haven't even worked out how to do their own cross-border customs management processes. How do we draw them up into the EU where everything's digital, food safety standards, REACH, all of these different things? So I suppose what worries me is that at a governmental level, we're going to think about the South more as risk, migration, terrorism, disease, and not as opportunity, because we're just 5 to 10 years at least away from being able to do this in a practical way. That leaves it to business. That leaves it to companies to have to play more of a role. Now, maybe the role there for governments is to think more about, rather than subsidizing ourselves, protect business, insurance cover, export credit guarantees, incentives amongst those countries for, if not Pan-African integration, maybe the Horn of Africa, SADC. There are all sorts of structures there that you could support. I don't have all the answers. I don't spend enough time thinking about it. Maybe I should. Obviously, for North Africa and for Spain, there is the energy track, which is so important. And I know that if you could get Morocco better engaged in that particular thing, they want to take responsibility of sub-Saharan Africa. It doesn't have to be Europe. I've heard many Moroccan diplomats say, help us work with sub-Saharan Africa, because they come to us first. And you know this in Spain particularly. So I think there is a way of trying to sort of do that vertical in a staged way. Government supporting the private sector, engaging with North Africa. That relies obviously on the Spanish-French relationship as well, on energy interconnectors. I think that is now finally starting to improve. Pero sí, hacer la penitencia fue una frase que no lo voy a olvidar.
Sí, yo creo que tienes mucha razón. De nuestro lado tenemos que hacer mucho más y poner mucho más dinero también, ¿no?
Sí.
en el básquet. Pero cambiando ya de geografía y volviendo a tus palabras al principio, y yo lo primero que tengo que decir a José que es una oportunidad fantástica contar con él aquí y hablar de todo, ¿no? Y hablar también que interactuemos ahora en breve, ¿no? Has explicado al principio que había un elemento, por decirlo así, estructural en lo que está pasando. Una cosa que ocurre y que solidifica unas fallas en la relación este-oeste, ahora hablamos de norte-sur. Pero volviendo un poquito hacia el año anterior o los 2 años anteriores, ¿qué habría pasado si en vez de estar Biden estuviera Trump en Washington?
La ironía de donde estamos es que hemos hecho lo que Trump pidió que deberíamos hacer no sé si os acordáis del desayuno que tuvo Trump con Stoltenberg antes de la cumbre, creo que fue en Bruselas, sí. Hace 3 años, algo así. Y entraron las cámaras para ver que... Pero normal, hola, sí, vamos a un buen desayuno, muchas gracias, adiós. Y Trump dice, no, os quedáis aquí. Esto es lo que voy a decir a Stoltenberg y los europeos. Estáis comprando todo este gas de Rusia y nosotros pagando todo para defenderos, inaceptable. E incluso compráis el gas de ellos y no de nosotros. Esto no puede pasar, bla, bla, bla. ¿Dónde estamos hoy? Hemos hecho todo lo que Trump hubiera querido. Estamos comprando el gas de Estados Unidos, estamos pagando 2% más del Producto Bruto económico de nuestros países. ¿Qué hubiera pasado? Lo que hubiera pasado es que, como yo decía antes, los republicanos, da igual dónde está Trump, los republicanos y durante Trump reforzaron las sanciones contra Rusia, bajo Trump, a pesar de todo lo que se decía de Trump is in the pocket of the Russians, que es posible, por his bad property deals y todo eso. Pero la realidad es que los Estados Unidos hubieran hecho lo que han hecho ahora, en mi opinión. Bajo Trump se dio más dinero a OTAN. Bajo Trump se hicieron sanciones más fuertes contra Rusia. Y Trump hubiera dicho, I told you so. Thank you very much. And if he becomes president, hope he doesn't, if he becomes president, he'll say, you see, I was right. So I don't think it would have been different. If your question is about whether there's a structural division, in a way, underlying all of this between Europe and America, the relationship has been difficult, especially under Trump. But it was difficult under Obama as well. He wasn't interested in Europe. What was it who somebody said that our thinking of American presidents was, I've got to get this right, too strong, too strong, too weak, too much, too little. The last 4 presidents, think about it. Yeah, too strong, too weak, too much, too little. Thinking about the last 4 presidents and how we thought about them. I think the reality is that America had been moving towards more about China. We'd been worrying more about our future, about Africa, etc. But what this war has done, it has cemented again Europe and America. We now rely on America for a marginal amount of our gas. And the marginal amount, as we know, in all commodity trade is the powerful bit. The people who can give you the extra barrel, the extra X megawatt hours of gas, they're the ones who control it. And America, in a way, is our marginal production, on top of Norway, on top of Algeria, on top of Qatar, wherever. We rely on them in a way for our security, again, like we did before. Europe, whatever it can do on defense, when you have a real enemy, we need American organization, American high-tech, American satellite. So we are stuck together again. But I think it's two-way. America cannot, and this is what Biden understands that Trump did not understand. America can't take on China without Europe. If Europe is going its own track on China, then in a way, America is not strong enough, especially given that the global south is sympathetic to China. So I think structurally we're linked. And my last thing I'd say on this is I've always been a bit skeptical, maybe as a Brit, about European strategic autonomy, but I've only been skeptical about it because it was always talked about as something that would allow Europe to be more independent of America. I've always thought of European strategic autonomy as a way for Europe to be a better ally with America. And it's in our interest to do that, because at some point we might have another Trump, and then we better be able to be, a better ally on our own terms.
Bueno, la última pregunta y ya paso al público, que estará deseando hacer muchas más y mucho más inteligentes. Hablamos siempre de la dependencia de Europa de Estados Unidos, pero no hablamos de algo que creo que es obvio y que la crisis de Ucrania nos lo ha demostrado de forma palpable, que es la dependencia europea de Alemania. Alemania como el gran tractor de Europa, ¿no? Y, por supuesto, cuando hablo de Europa, hablo de la Unión Europea. No quiero incluir a tus
Ser muy francés,
paisanos. En ese sentido, hay una preocupación latente y cada día más creciente, tanto en los economistas alemanes como en las zonas de debate más fringe en esta discusión, de si la nueva situación en la que Alemania ya no tiene el enorme asset de una energía inagotable y barata y su situación tan vulnerable al conflicto en el este no deteriora esa gran relación de intercambio que tiene la Unión Europea con el resto del mundo, que es la que le hace a la Unión Europea capaz de ser un actor global. Porque no nos olvidemos, si Europa es un actor global, es básicamente gracias a Alemania. Es un resumen un poco exagerado, pero creo que bastante justo. ¿Cómo ves en esta nueva coyuntura y con estos problemas ya de tipo estructural, que al menos durarán todo lo que dure la reconversión tecnológica del mundo industrial alemán, cómo ves tú esta transición de menos competitividad de la Unión Europea en su conjunto y de debilidad frente a terceros de la Unión Europea desde el punto de vista económico?
No, una pregunta muy, muy importante. Es algo que a momentos voy pensando lo mismo que tú sobre este tema. Y la realidad para Alemania es no solamente que no puede beneficiar de importaciones de gas ruso a precios muy, muy bajos para empujar su sistema económico, pero incluso que de poco a poco está perdiendo su competitividad en China. Porque, como decían siempre, cheap Russian gas to sell cheap products to China. Vi unas cifras el otro día de que el año pasado coches vendidos en China por la primera vez, 50% eran EVs, electrical vehicles. De ese 50%, 80% construidos por compañías chinas. Y vamos a 80% de los coches, o a 100% de los coches serán EVs, y no serán Mercedes-Benz, la mayoría, posiblemente de lujo. Y esto es un problema fundamental, incluso porque sabemos que construir EVs tiene menos tecnología industrial, digamos, y más tecnología electrónica, que todavía no es el lado fuerte de la comunidad alemana. Entonces sí, tengo esa preocupación, que Alemania va a pasar una etapa muy difícil de reforma, de adaptación, y no sabemos si saldrá del otro lado. También estoy consciente, y solo estoy diciendo tu pregunta más sobre tu pregunta, que sin Alemania el euro es mucho más débil. Grecia no hubiera sobrevivido sin la confianza en la economía alemana y con los bajos tasas de interés que tienen los alemanes. Y si Alemania es más floja, entonces el euro, the Eurozone, es más débil, digamos. Y si hay otra crisis, Alemania no estará ahí para poder ayudarlo. Entonces, todo esto va a decir, sí. Mi respuesta. Bueno, dos cosas. A los alemanes no les gusta estar detrás y tengo confianza en su poder de cambio, de reforma, de adaptación, incluso tecnológica. Pero lo interesante será, solo ahora tienen una opción. La Alemania, iba a decir los alemanes, Alemania ha sido muy pro-integración en las zonas donde les gusta ser pro-integración. Y han sido muy recalcitrantes, si eso es una palabra,
sí,
I'm trying to use English words in Spanish, recalcitrantes en zonas donde no lo querían. Por ejemplo, la energía. Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 1, esto era política alemana, no era política europea. Y todavía no hay una Europa, a real capital market union. There's not a real financial union in Europe. The Germans aren't interested in it. Entonces, lo que pienso es que Alemania tendrá que ser mucho más serio en la integración europea, en realmente llevar este mercado en las zonas donde no hay el mercado único. Tecnología, dinero, energía, porque ahora Alemania no puede tomar ventaja del mercado único, que es lo que estaba haciendo, diciendo, sí, we're the most pro-European. Eso es el cambio. No tienen más opción, no les queda más remedio.
Me pareció muy, muy inteligente tu respuesta, no solo porque coincido con ella, sino simplemente porque me parece que lo has visto muy bien y lo has explicado muy bien. Bueno, yo no quiero monopolizar las preguntas porque seguro que tenéis muchas y muy interesantes. Os pediría que quien pregunte se presente. Así sabemos quién está hablando.
Sí, aquí atrás. Buenas noches, excelente presentación, mis sinceras felicitaciones. Yo soy José Luis Cordeiro, hispano-venezolano, nací en Caracas. Mis padres emigraron de España cuando España era pobre y dictadura y Venezuela era rica y democrática. Ahora se ha volteado la tortilla. Entonces había 500.000 de españoles en Venezuela, ahora es al revés, ahora hay 500.000 de venezolanos en España. Pero mi pregunta es que habló de todos estos países que una vez se llamaron el eje del mal, the axis of evil.
Sí.
Y bueno, resulta que todos ellos colaboran con Venezuela. Venezuela cerró la embajada de Corea del Sur para abrir una embajada en Corea del Norte, es algo inaudito. Y tiene las mejores relaciones con Irán. Hay vuelos directos entre Venezuela e Irán. Esto es increíble. O sea, ¿qué tiene que ver Irán con Venezuela para que haya vuelos directos? Y bueno, y hablo de Rusia y hablo de China. Son los países que soportan al régimen peor, diría, del mundo, porque la crisis humanitaria más grande en este momento no es Ucrania. Venezuela tiene el doble de migrantes, con la mitad de la población.
Disculpe un segundo, perdone.
Es Venezuela. Venezuela en el concepto geopolítico, porque habló de todo menos de Venezuela.
Vamos a intentar que te pregunten más. Ven, estupendo.
No, qué cifras más fascinantes que no me daba cuenta de ese desequilibrio, cómo ha cambiado de un lado al otro. Pero, ¿qué decir? Lo que me preocupa en este momento es que el eje del mal, si se puede, no sé si es un concepto que ayuda porque les da una concentración, it gives them a sense of belonging, that it's an axis of convenience more than an axis of evil. I mean, they're evil regimes, all of them actually, all the ones you described there. But I'm not sure it's helpful to call them an axis of evil. What would I say about this? The problems we have is that, and this goes back actually slightly to the problem of why haven't been able to help Africa, why in the end can't America do a vertical? Why can't America engage and help and participate in a truly sustainable political economic recovery south of its border? And I think the problem here is it's not totally in our control. There's this idea, and maybe the way I talk about it, it sounds like we control it. But yes, Europe, whether in Latin America or in Africa, could provide more export credit guarantees, could provide more insurance, more conditional assistance, more foreign aid. It could do all of those things. But in the end, it is up to these countries and these peoples as well to find a way through, not to be led by corrupt people. I don't believe that Venezuela, it is backed, obviously Maduro has been backed by Cuba, which is backed by Russia, and to a certain extent it got loans from China. They are helped, but it could potentially have got loans from other parts as well. So what I don't understand, I literally do not understand, is how it is that those countries across Latin America, and Venezuela is an extreme case, but there are aspects of instability across Latin America. Why you have gone backwards and others have gone forward? I cannot place it. Hopefully somebody can tell me over drinks later on what has driven it. But I suppose what I'm trying to say to you here is there is an element to get to this future where the world I've described to you, Europe, the United States, the G7 countries, I'm afraid, are going to be looking after themselves more for the next 5 to 10 years. They're going to have little money and little bandwidth politically to worry about Venezuela or to worry about Morocco or to worry about, take your pick of countries that are really suffering at the moment and being led by dictators. Because they're going to be spending all of their effort trying to adapt themselves to this new divided world and make sure that we are secure. And the priority will be to try to stop democracies from going backwards, to stop Hungary, or at one point we were worried about the Czech Republic, or to worry about Thailand remaining a military junta and then slowly becoming more and more susceptible to Chinese influence. We're going to be fighting for the countries that are still democracies and that are wobbling, including ourselves in many cases. And so countries like Venezuela and so on, I'm afraid, are prey to, P-R-E-Y, to countries like Iran and North Korea that want any friends they can get. And the worry here, to fit into my thesis earlier, is that China and Russia right now, because we see them as aligned, are bankrolling, the baddies. It is literally like a James Bond movie, I think, sometimes. It's like Smersh, Putin is Smersh. Whoever with the cat. It's crazy stuff. It's that bad. So I think the best, sorry to be worried about myself, but at the moment, we're all worried about ourselves. You're worried about Venezuela, I'm worried about my community. What we need to do is to become, again, a pole that others want to imitate, that others want to join. I'm not sure we can do much more than that. Sympathize. People backed the opposition strongly against Maduro. I don't know what happened. Somewhere along the line, either Maduro was too strong and too brutal, but I don't think he's as brutal as the Iranians. The Iranians know how to be brutal, and the Russians, and the Chinese, and the North Koreans. I don't understand why Venezuela is still where it is. In any case, so we're not going to answer the question here. Okay. That was me waving my arms, not having an answer, I'm afraid.
No, es un problema que necesitamos más de una margarita para
sí, para
resolverlo.
Resolver a Venezuela.
Yo quería, aparte de preguntaros, quería hacer publicidad de algo que acabo de publicar en el último número de Política Exterior, porque toca el tema tuyo que has mencionado, que es una política española para la vecindad del sur, ¿no? Que es un poco mi obsesión. Y por eso me gustaría que alguien preguntara de algo distinto, para que no hablemos solamente de sur y norte, sino de otras fracturas.
Me llamo Iñaki Gil y quisiera preguntarle sobre el reto que supone para el régimen chino el fracaso de la política contra el COVID. Si cree que el desprestigio que Xi Jinping ha tenido en su lucha contra el COVID puede hacer tambalearse el régimen o sus fundamentos económicos.
Creo que comprendí la pregunta. Había trocitos que no he oído bien. Pero Xi Jinping, ¿cómo está manejando el COVID? ¿Qué es su estrategia? ¿Por qué lo ha hecho? ¿Sí, más o menos?
Sí, sobre todo si eso es un riesgo para él y para
Sí,
su
es un
sistema.
riesgo. Sí, es importante esa pregunta, por una razón, porque puedo decir algo que no pude decir antes. Yo creo que ha sido un échec. It's a black mark against Xi Jinping. So, lo que dije en mi presentación fue que Xi Jinping pudo hacer este U-turn, este cambio, porque está bastante fuerte políticamente, domésticamente, para hacerlo. Y está apostando de que antes del finales del año la economía china surgirá otra vez y todo el mundo se olvidará del millón más que habrá muerto a causa de COVID y todo irá bien. El problema que tiene es que los miembros del Partido Comunista no van a olvidar que fue un fallo fundamental continuar la política de COVID que tenían, las restricciones, y que no prepararon el cambio. No se preparó, se hizo así y han muerto mucha más gente de lo que hubieran muerto porque no se preparó. Y esto es un black mark contra Xi Jinping, que depende de dónde estamos en 3 años, 4 años, cuando se está pensando 2027 al próximo cumbre del partido, el 21st Party Congress, se tendrá que pensar, ¿tenemos Xi Jinping para una 4ª vez o no? Y porque la decisión que tenga un tercer término no es tan revolucionario. Es importante, pero no es tan revolucionario. Si tiene una 4ª, estamos en Mao Zedong time. Y el Partido Comunista Chino, de lo que yo comprendo, es muy autoprotectivo. Y han visto que Xi Jinping, he's fallible. He made a real mistake. And if there's problems with China in 2-3 years' time with the economy, this mistake will come back to haunt him, as we say in English. Yeah? He will pay a price. But he's not going to pay a price right now. Everyone's focused on making money and traveling and trying to be happy again. But the party will not forget. And older people in the party remember the Mao era, the dangers of a single leader in power for too long. And you could not have had a better example of what happens in dictatorships when people can't tell people the truth than how they handle COVID.
Interesantísimo. Por aquí, señor.
Sí, muchas gracias, Luis de Carlos, abogado. Quería preguntar 2 cosas. Una, ¿cómo cree que podría ser la evolución de la guerra de Ucrania en 2023? Y la segunda, Estados Unidos ha alcanzado el techo de la deuda. Sí, hay un riesgo de default de los Estados Unidos en 2023.
Bueno, la segunda pregunta primero. Nada original, sí, hay un riesgo. Bueno, me parece que esto irá mal, por la razón tan sencilla que Kevin McCarthy casi no tiene una mayoría. La única razón por la cual es el portavoz, Speaker of the House of Representatives, es porque ha prometido a los extremistas que va a prohibir ir más allá del techo de la deuda sin cortes de expenses, ¿no? de lo que se despensa. De gastos, gracias. Y estaremos, cuando esto llega a su punto intenso, que será este verano, estaremos ya pensando de las elecciones presidenciales. Y Biden va a querer hacer lo que hizo Clinton cuando esto pasó, lo que hizo Obama cuando esto pasó, que es demostrar que la presidencia al final, al cabo, es más fuerte que el House of Representatives. Y siempre esto ha sido una ventaja para los presidentes demócratas y han ganado a través de una batalla sobre el techo de la deuda. Pero los republicanos se están metiendo en exactamente el mismo problema porque no que lo quieren hacerlo, pero por esta guerra civil que tienen dentro del partido. Entonces sí habrá una lucha y va a acordar al mundo que los Estados Unidos tiene sus debilidades realmente fundamentales y esto podría tener un impacto claro sobre los mercados financieros globales. Depende de dónde estamos en el mercado global y todo, y dónde estamos con COVID y dónde estamos con energy prices, es que no sabemos dónde estaremos. Yo creo que energy prices no estará tan mal este invierno. Se pensaba hace 2 o 3 meses que 23 sería peor que 22, no lo creo. Pero a pesar de eso, es un riesgo fundamental, no puedo decir más que eso. Ucrania, 2023. Mi instinto es que vamos hacia Corea. Esto es lo que decía el año pasado yo y todavía no lo veo diferente. Creo que sí tendrán Leopard 2 tanks y tendrán... los ucranianos están entrenando, ellos sí tienen la capacidad, los dos lados planean hacer a Spring Offensive, los dos, seguro. Y creo el Spring Offensive de los ucranianos será intentar de cortar entre Zaporizhia y Gerson, las provincias que están encima de Crimea. Cortarlos, si pueden, ir hacia Azov, hacer un breakthrough, pero los rusos, claro, saben que lo van a hacer y se han preparado y no es una zona tan buena. Tendrán tanks blindados, what are they called? Leopard 2, pero los rusos tendrán 200, 300 más tropas que tenían antes. Y atacar es más difícil, como sabemos, que defender. Entonces, bueno, estoy diciendo como yo lo voy pensando, is that there's like a trade-off between Russian force, numbers, capacity to defend, and strength in supply lines in depth. Because Russia has all of Russia behind it, and Ukraine's not allowed to attack Russia. So they've got strength in depth, numbers, and defense. The Ukrainians have Western tanks, but maybe not many. Let's see. They're going to give 12. What was it, 14? 14 tanks, the Germans said, am I right? Yeah. What will we get to? 50? 80? You need 300-400 to do, a breakthrough. I don't know if they're going to get to that number. Because again, it's difficult. This is difficult for Europe, bit by bit. And then you miss the moment. If they had 300 tanks today, trained, yeah, maybe you get through. But I'm not so sure. So I suppose I'm saying, I know there are some American generals, I heard this the other day, American military. This is not Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, thinks that it's going to be stalemate. Apparently, there are a number of American generals who think there's going to be a breakthrough. They're convinced of it. Americans have often been right. So I'm being careful here to say that it's a crazy idea. But there are some Americans who think that they'll push through and will make a real breakthrough somewhere in the front line. But remember, think of Ukraine. The Russians always have, if things go really bad in the south, they'll find a way to attack from the north. Even if they lose troops, they'll go for Kiev again. They'll do something to pull them back. So honestly, I'm speaking to you out loud, trying to think it through, because there's no good answer. So I think default, stalemate at the end of the year. They both tried, they both won something. They got stuck maybe in a new line. Maybe the lines changed a bit. And that's probably wrong, because that's predictable. So, yeah.
No has mencionado nuclear.
Interesting. I am in the camp of people, again, a very risky thing to say, I'm in the camp of people, which is a majority, I think, of analysts, that think it is highly unlikely, highly unlikely, that the Russians will use nuclear weapons, even if the Ukrainians were able to punch through Melitopol down towards the Sea of Azov. I will reserve, if they actually invade Crimea, if they actually get onto Crimean soil, I reserve my judgment. Then, okay, I don't know, maybe. But I think anything before that, it doesn't make sense. It is ineffective as a military weapon. I mean, there's an amazing statistic that if you have dispersed forces, a tactical nuclear weapon might knock out 5 tanks in a particular area. They literally just don't, they're not destructive. Yes, they give off nuclear material and so on. Of course, that's a problem for the Russians as much as it's for the other. Where's it going to go? They would be, even the Chinese would then drop them. The Chinese cannot afford to allow nuclear weapons to be used in that area. Japan will go nuclear. South Korea will go nuclear. It is such an extreme scenario for the Russians, I'm saying. There's so many negatives. I know we've always said this about Putin. He can't be that mad. And he was mad enough to attack Kiev. But you can see what he was thinking. I can't even see what he'd be thinking here. So yeah, that's not at the top of my risk. Yeah.
Sí.
Hola, buenas noches. Soy Paloma Baena. Un placer escucharle. Me ha sorprendido un poco al final, bueno, un poco no, me ha sorprendido mucho, para ser sincera, la referencia al G7+ en lugar de al multilateralismo.
Sí.
Cuando después, en la respuesta anterior, claramente la realidad es que el G7 defiende sus intereses, que son unos intereses muy limitados en una institución completamente informal, donde no hay reglas del juego, donde no sabemos cómo se toman decisiones, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, la pregunta es si el multilateralismo está fallando, que es cierto, porque es, y qué debemos hacer para no abandonarlo, porque todos estos temas de fondo son temas globales que nos afectan a todos y que requieren soluciones multilaterales.
No, muchas gracias. Mira, lo que yo decía era como analista en vez, bueno, mitad. Analista y después una recomendación. Mi lado analista, sadly, tristemente, me dice que el multilateralismo, it's an uphill task right now. It's really difficult. It's difficult also because the countries of the South feel their voice isn't represented in the multilateral organizations. And they're having to find their own alternatives, which is why they are so open to Russian and Chinese arguments, money, and influence. And as you can probably hear, and I've said it again on the stage, so I'll repeat myself, my mind at the moment my own mind is defensive. I feel that if we lose a G7+, however unjust that grouping is, yeah, and however much I want it to look south and not just look to itself, but at least that group is a group of liberal democracies. It's like a Noah's Ark, yeah, in my geopolitically divided sea, yeah. You know, I want to know it's going to survive. I want to know it's strong, because I think other countries will join it, and that is part of, you know, rebuild like the GATT in 1949 when the world was, who knows where it was going to go. And many people then joined the GATT and it became the WTO, and we had multilateral trading system. But they joined it because the GATT worked and it made sense. At the moment, there are many leaders around the world, including those who talk about multilateralism, who want it just as a talking shop, and which don't want to improve their own systems of governance in their countries, and who are quite happy to take Russian money or Russian military protection or Chinese money to do things their way. So I myself have become a bit cynical about multilateralism, even though I'm a European. What can we do to help multilateralism? Despite that, I'm just justifying my earlier comment first. But yes, I mean, if you don't have multilateralism, how do you deal with climate? How do you deal with space? How do you deal with health? So pick your areas of multilateralism. Chatham House has been an absolutely strong supporter of the COP process. I believe in it, I buy in it. It's a targeted area. Go for it. I think nationally determined contributions, it's pretty light multilateralism. There's no legal agreement, but there are ways of maneuvering it, yeah, with transparency, naming and shaming, the North giving to the South. There's ways of using it, yeah. On global health, I'm a big believer in working with China and the WHO. I'm not one of these people that says, chuck them out or don't talk to them or who knows where COVID came from. Bury it. It's like borders. Let's not go there. We'll never get a good answer. So I think work with China as much as we can, the WHO. This COVID latest thing has not been good. They have not shared information. Should be talking to you. They have not shared information about their latest thing and so on. So that would be another area. The Convention on Biodiversity, that was amazing. Canadian and Chinese joint chairmanship, meant to be held in China. The Canadians offered to hold it. The Canadians helped with the Chinese push through a pretty big deal. So I haven't given up. Yeah? I haven't given up. But this is a geopolitical presentation, and you need anchors. And I think the G7 Plus is an anchor for me.
Robin, me parece que una pregunta más, ¿no? A ver.
Well, I'll go quickly if you want, round quick.
Bueno, cogemos dos seguidas. Esta señora y este señor ahí. Pero primero, la señora es primero.
Voy rápido.
Hola, buenas tardes y muchas gracias por su brillante análisis. Me llamo Begoña Ochoa de Olza y soy diplomática, trabajo en temas migratorios y Schengen. Le quería hacer una pregunta más centrada en Europa y es un poco en torno al debate tradicional sobre el realismo y el idealismo. Con el ejemplo que ha mencionado usted sobre Alemania, que tiene menos interés en avanzar en la integración en aquellos ámbitos que no le interesan, ¿dónde cree que queda el principio de solidaridad, que está precisamente en el origen de la Unión Europea? ¿Existe todavía algo de idealismo en la Unión Europea? ¿Cabe esperar que existe? ¿O prevalecen, digamos, los intereses nacionales y queda poco hueco para el idealismo actualmente? Muchas gracias.
Esa pregunta kantiana la resuelves en 3 minutos. Y ese señor, y ya cerramos con esto. El señor de la chaqueta verde sin mangas.
Buenas tardes. Andrés Villanueva, soy ingeniero. Quería agradecerle la exposición que ha hecho esta tarde y su análisis desde distintas perspectivas políticas, económicas, comerciales, energéticas, pero creo que hay una perspectiva muy potente que no se le ha dado la suficiente importancia, como por ejemplo la sociocultural. Mientras que en China tienen, por ejemplo, modelos productivos orientados al get the job done, por ejemplo, en Europa estamos pensando en jornadas laborales de 4 días. Vamos a tratar de hacer el trabajo de la forma más bonita y posiblemente de la forma menos eficiente, camuflándonos en la palabra productividad, mientras posiblemente seamos la parte menos productiva en la parte manufacturera, por ejemplo, a nivel mundial. ¿Qué implicaciones pueden tener estas tendencias de cara a la competitividad de Europa como continente?
Ok.
3 minutos.
Voy a empezar con ese y terminar con the big question. Maybe in English to be quick. And I know you all speak English. Thank you very much. One of the reasons I feel most European is because of the socio-cultural life here. Maybe this ties into realism and solidarity as well in a minute. But I believe that Europe is the most advanced form of human socio-political cultural life. Oh boy, that was a big statement to make publicly. Never mind, I've said it. I do. I mean, I'm looking around. I'm not talking about communities, and we've done terrible things, and we carry on to do terrible things. But, you know, I came back from America to live in Europe for many reasons, but that was one of them. And I say this because I think, and this is saying incredibly hierarchical, never mind, I'll keep going. I think that China, you said it's 7 days, you know, work till you drop stuff. It's interesting, since COVID, have you heard of this wonderful phrase, the lying down generation? Now, many Chinese are saying, no, that's not what I want to do. I mean, I think what we were doing in the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom and the way workers' rights were trampled on and terribly treated. But we moved up, unionization, socio-cultural, think about solidarity, etc. The second country in the world, the second Blue Planet 2, David Attenborough, the environmental program, The country with the second most viewership, apparently, I was told this a few years ago, was China. Huge move to environmentalism in China. And people caring, about animals, whereas we think of them all eating shark's fin soup, So I'm a big believer in human evolution, human progress, learning, not remaking the lessons of the mistakes of the past. I think Europe has made more mistakes than most parts of the world, which is why, in a way, we're now in a better place. We had the Holocaust. We had colonialism. Take your pick. We have done some of the worst stuff ever to ourselves and to others. We've paid the price. We're learning. London being blitzed. So it's a long way of saying, yes, I didn't talk about sociocultural. Maybe I should. Maybe it's a good thing I didn't, given what I just said. I get myself in real trouble. But I do think that the world will not be divided by that in the end. We will all be divided internally, as we are polarized now in Europe by politics, by cultural issues that are not the difference between China and Europe. It's the difference between people who have money, those who don't, people who feel more confident in a technologically advanced world and people who prefer the certainty of the past, between people who have more authoritarian instincts, which are often about wanting to feel safe, people who fear change, people who embrace change, people who've had the opportunity of good education, people who haven't. This all exists within our societies. It's not China versus Europe or America. I think we're all on the same journey. But within our societies, I'm more worried about the divisions inside them, I suppose. I think that was an answer to that question. And now I'm going to really struggle on this one. Realism and irrealism in Europe. I gave a pretty realist take in the end, hence my answer to the question about G7 and multilateralism. I think what I was most disappointed about when I came back, this is a way to answer quickly. When I came back from America, I did 10, 15 years in America working on the Europe program at CSIS. And I came back to the UK. The first thing I wanted to do was do a project on kind of Britain's role in Europe and what Britain could do in the EU. It was not Europe, the EU. Britain and the EU. And having come from America, I'm pretty realist. What could Britain get out of it? And what could Britain give back? But what's the trade-off? Where are we strong? What do we get? What are we not? And I've always thought that's the best way to go into it. I think if you bring an element of realism, then you retain political support for your political parties to then do the ambitious things. You can only be ambitious in a democracy if the people feel that you're realist about their concerns. And then you earn the trust to be ambitious. You are able to be ambitious, maybe unreal, in Europe because of the Second World War. It allowed France and Germany to do things then they could never do today because they had the discipline of the Second World War. We lost discipline over the last 20, 30 years. We're going to get discipline back, I think, now because of Russia and China, and hence Germany maybe having to do the integration model. So I think bringing elements of realism important. But my last comment here, and it links up your two questions, we must not forget about the power of myth, of lies. Myth is the good side, lies is the bad side. Narratives and stories that appeal to people's desire not to believe the truth. These are very powerful emotions. And part of our job, I think, in our institutions, Aspen, Elcano, Chatham House, Caixa Forum, and so on, is to make sure that we reach out to the people who believe the myths that are irreal and unreal, and give them a doorway through to truth. Because that doorway isn't always easy for people to work through when they don't benefit from the truth. And when I got back to the UK, I discovered that people didn't want to talk about the real. They wanted to talk about the myth of Britain. That was more exciting, it was more moving, it was more real than the reality of where Britain was in Europe. And we wrote this paper, and trying to talk to conservatives about it, it was just like, when people don't want to accept the answer, they don't believe the truth to the answer, to which you've given the answer. Climate change was the same. I remember people denying climate. I realized it had nothing to do with climate. They didn't accept the answer. What the answer meant for their lives, maybe changing their way of life. And if they had to change their way of life, they'd rather say no to changing their way of life and keeping than believing a falsehood. So we have a lot of responsibility here to reach out and make sure our societies aren't as divided as they are now. It's difficult at times, because at times I'm like, oh, I just can't be bothered to explain this again. And you start to feel, resentful. But yeah, that's not a productive feeling. So I'll stop there.
Bueno, con este toque realista, no pesimista, realista, que has tenido, Robin, yo creo que podemos cerrar con una frase que a mí siempre me ha encantado de uno de mis políticos favoritos de Europa, que era Helmut Schmidt, que siempre decía que cuando un político tenía visiones, lo que le decía es que fuera el oculista. Muchas gracias. Gracias, Robin, por tu intervención.
Gracias.